Lesson 34, the Perfect Participle, the Ablative Absolute. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 102, and we have two very important things to talk about today, the Perfect Passive Participle and the Ablative Absolute. Actually, what you'll find is that these two grammatical elements are closely related because oftentimes, not all the time, but often in an ablative absolute, there will be a perfect passive participle. So I think that's why the authors of the book are introducing these two grammatical elements in the same lesson, because they're somewhat related. So let's dive in and start talking about the perfect passive participle. Let's skip over section 273 for the moment and go directly to 274. And we'll circle back around to 273. So what is the perfect passive participle, or as they term it here, the perfect participle? And why am I calling it the perfect passive participle, while the authors of the book are only calling it the perfect participle? What's the deal with that? Why the difference in names? So we have a few things to talk about here. First and foremost, this thing that we're discussing now, the perfect passive participle, is a participle. So a quick reminder, what's a participle? A participle is a verbal adjective. It's a word that functions as an adjective. It is an adjective, but at the heart of the word, it's really a verb. So in textbooks, what they'll say is it's a verbal adjective. An adjective with a verby kind of quality to it. So just for fun, we might say that the crunchy outside of a participle is an adjective, while the chewy center is a verb. And at this point, you actually have had some good experience working with participles. First of all, you've learned present active participles. We studied those a few lessons ago. You know that those decline like third declension I stems. For example, laudans, L-A-U-D-A-N-S, is the present participle, nominative singular, of the verb laudo. So laudans is nominative singular, laudantis is genitive singular, and so on and so forth. And so that present active participle means praising. Okay, it's in the present tense, and it describes action that is being done actively. And then we studied future passive participles, otherwise known as gerundives. For the verb laudo, we would have forms like laudandus, laudanda, laudandum. A future passive participle describes action that is supposed to take place in the future. It's experienced passively by someone. It's not active, but passive. And often it communicates the idea that something ought to be done or must be done. So if you say that someone is laudandus, that means that that person is to be praised in the sense of ought to be praised. Okay, so that's future and passive. Now in this lesson, we're going to study a new kind of participle, a kind of participle that the authors of this book are referring to as the perfect participle, but I'm referring to it as the perfect passive participle. First of all, it's a participle that describes action that has already been completed. Okay, and so what tense is associated with activity that has already been completed? The answer is the perfect tense. I've explained it many times. You know that the word perfect means finished, done, completed, accomplished, things like that. And so since this participle that we're studying here is called a perfect participle, that means that it's telling us in an adjectival kind of way, as an adjective, that somebody or something has experienced action that has already been completed. Perfect tense is the kind of time scheme that we're talking about here. Why am I calling it passive, but the authors of the book are not? Here is the reason. In Latin, there is no perfect active participle, technically speaking. We're going to actually circle around back to that concept in the future. We're not quite there yet. But for right now, just in your mind, picture that Latin does not really have a perfect active participle. We only have the perfect passive participle as far as a perfect tense participle. So long story short, a perfect passive participle exists, but a perfect active one does not. So there's only one kind of perfect participle. Since there's only one kind, the authors of the book don't feel the need to distinguish it from anything. They don't feel the need to call it the perfect passive participle because a perfect active one doesn't exist. So they call it the perfect participle because that's the only perfect tense participle we have. For me, and for every other teacher I know, and every textbook I've seen, they call it the perfect passive participle in order to just be more clear and more specific. So if you want, you can get a pencil or pen and write yourself a little note there at the beginning of section 274. Between the words perfect and participle, you could add a little word there that says passive. So it says perfect passive participle. So what exactly does a perfect passive participle communicate? When you use one, what are you saying or communicating about someone or something? A perfect passive participle says that someone or something experienced passively some kind of action being done to them in the past. In English, the way we say this very commonly is with a verb that has the ending ed. Let's take, for example, the verb to paint. Okay, if you have a fence in your backyard and you paint it, then you could say the fence is painted. And the word painted is a perfect passive participle. Notice the ending ed at the end. So when you say it's painted, that means that in the past, the activity of painting was done to the fence, and the fence experienced that activity being done to it passively. So a painted fence is a fence that passively was painted in the past. Also, the idea of painted carries with it the idea that that past activity still holds, and that the past activity of painting is still something that you could say is true about that fence. So the fence currently is in a state of having been painted. Some teachers, when they talk about the perfect tense, they say that the perfect tense describes action that happened in the past, but still carries with it or still creates some kind of current status. In other words, the activity happened in the past, but the results of that activity still persist to the present. I think they say something like past activity, but with a present state or with a present result, something like that. So if you say that the fence is painted, you're saying that it passively experienced the act of painting in the past, but that it holds that state now. That state of being painted is still true now. So the activity was in the past, but the results of it persist through to the present. Okay, let's try another one. Let's take the verb wash. Let's say you want to wash your car. Once you're finished washing the car, you could say the car is washed. Again, notice the ed ending at the end. That's often how we make a perfect passive participle in English. Not every verb can be made into a perfect passive participle with the ed ending, but many of them can. So if you wash your car and you say it's washed, you're saying that the car passively experienced, in the past, the act of being washed, and that you can currently describe the car as being washed. So it has the time frame of the activity having been done in the past, but with a current result that you can say that the car now is washed. So that's what a perfect passive participle is. both in English and in Latin. The meaning is the same. The thing that it's communicating is the same. And before we go further, just let me point out that there is no active participle in the perfect tense in English or in Latin. There is no perfect active participle. So in English, there is no one-word participle that you can use to say that a fence actively did some painting or that a car actively did some washing. If we want to say that kind of thing in English, we have to use more than one word. Typically, the word we would use is the word having. So if I want to take a perfect passive participle, like washed or painted, and I want to make it active, I could say having washed or having painted. Of course, a fence cannot pick up a paintbrush and paint anything. A fence is just a fence. So that's the kind of thing you might say about a person. You might say, well, Bob or Sheila, they having painted the fence. So with the words having and painted, you can make a description of Bob or Sheila that shows that they have actively done some activity in the past. But there is no way to do it with just one word, as you can with a perfect passive participle like painted or washed. So both in Latin and in English, we have perfect passive participles that consist of just one word, but we don't have those same ones in their active form. And I alluded to this a few minutes ago when I was talking about the name that they give it here, a perfect participle. Okay, so that's what a perfect passive participle communicates. How do we do that in Latin? What's the form that we use? Well, the answer is that it relates to the fourth principal part of the verbs that I've been teaching you. From the very beginning, I've been saying whenever you memorize a verb, don't just memorize the first principal part, the present tense, first person singular. Don't stop there. Memorize all four principal parts. For example, with the verb laudo, don't just memorize laudo means I praise, and then stop there. Memorize all four principal parts. Laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. Because I said, even if you don't understand what those verb forms are now, you'll need them later. And so guess what? Now is later, and you need that fourth principal part. Now, there's an interesting thing about the fourth principal part. In some textbooks, the fourth principal part ends with a US. For example, in some textbooks, if you open up the glossary and look up the word laudo, it will say laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatus. In other textbooks, like the one we're currently using, you'll open it up and it will say laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. So my point here is that not all textbooks agree on what the fourth principal part is. The ones that tell you that it ends with they call it the supine. The ones that tell you that it ends with US, they call that the perfect passive participle. When I was in high school, the textbook that we used had US for the fourth principal part. So I would memorize verbs like laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatus. Then later, when I saw other textbooks with there, I was confused. I thought, well, why is it different in different textbooks? And one day, I decided to look through all my textbooks on my shelf so I could figure out which one was correct, having the fourth principal part with or US. And so as I examined these different textbooks, I began to realize that it was about half and half. Approximately half of them show the fourth principal part ending with the other half shows it ending with US. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because when it says US there, like laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatus, what they're saying there with laudatus is that it's the perfect passive participle, which is an adjective. So that perfect passive participle is declined like a first and second declension adjective. So you'll have forms like you see here in section 274, laudatus, laudata, laudatum, for masculine, feminine, and neuter. So if you say the fourth principal part is laudatum, that's just a neuter form of the perfect passive participle. So really it doesn't matter which one you call it. The important part is that you get the main stem that you need to know how to make the different forms of that participle. Again, the textbooks that tell you it ends with UM, they call it the supine, which we'll cover later. We don't know about that yet. The ones that say it ends with US, they call it the perfect passive participle. Again, the only difference is just a declension ending that is either neuter or masculine. So really there's very little difference, but I just simply wanted to address the fact that some textbooks say it has UM at the end, others say it has US at the end. You can think of the fourth principal part that you've been memorizing as being the same as the neuter form of the perfect passive participle. So for the verb laudo, the perfect passive participle is laudatus, laudata, and laudatum. So you can picture in your mind that fourth principal part as being the same as that neuter perfect passive participle. So that's why in section 273, at the beginning of the lesson, they say supine stem. The supine stem is found by dropping UM of the supine. So if you take that fourth principal part, laudatum, and you remove the U and the M, that gives you LAUDAT. So that is the stem, not only of the supine, but of the perfect passive participle. So that stem there is what you add the first and second declension endings to get all the different forms of the perfect passive participle. So if you have a man who has been praised, you could say that that guy is laudatus. He's a praised man. If there's a woman who has been praised, you can say that she is laudata. She has been praised, and so you could say she is praised. If you have a town that has been praised, you could say that town is laudatum, praised. Okay, so you see these perfect passive participles, just like every other participle in Latin, they function as adjectives. In this case, first and second declension adjectives. For the second conjugation, we have the verb moneo, which means to advise or warn or instruct. The fourth principal part is monitum. So our perfect passive participle is monitus, monita, monitum. If you have a man who has been advised, you could say that guy is monitus. He's advised. If a woman has been advised, you could describe her as monita. She is advised. If a town has been advised, an oppidum, which is neuter, you could say that town is monitum. It's advised. Moving along to the bottom there, the fourth conjugation, we have the verb audio, which means hear. So if someone has been heard, we could describe them as auditus. If a man has been heard, you could say he is auditus. If a woman has been heard, you can say she's audita. If a town has been heard, auditum. From the third conjugation io variety, we have copio. The perfect passive participle is coptus, copta, coptum. If a man has been captured, you could say he's coptus. This is where we get our English word captive from. If a woman has been captured, you could describe her as copta, having been taken. If a town has been captured, you could say that town is coptum, having been taken. So not too difficult. These perfect passive participles really are not too hard. You have the letter T before the declension ending, and then it declines like a first and second declension adjective. Really not too difficult. Okay, let's move on now to section 275, and let's talk about a couple of model sentences, and we'll see examples of how a perfect passive participle can be used in a Latin sentence. And the text here in 275, these sentences here, where it says the perfect participle may be used, blah, blah, blah. I can just summarize that for you by saying you can use a perfect passive participle anywhere you can use an adjective. So since a participle is an adjective, you can use it as you would any other adjective. So you can use it in agreement with a noun, in agreement with a pronoun. You can use it like a predicate adjective. The part where it says to form the compound tenses of the passive voice, I'd like you to ignore that because we're not there yet. We haven't talked about those tenses yet. And if you think about that too much, it's just going to confuse you. So ignore that part. And for the moment, just think about a perfect passive participle simply as an adjective. An adjective that shows that someone or something experienced passively some kind of activity having been done to them in the past. So a perfect passive participle is a participle, and a participle is an adjective. So we can use these participles just like any other adjective. So let's take a look at these model sentences here in section 275. Number 1 says, Milites trans renum traducti castra posuerunt. Our subject here is milites, that means soldiers, and the verb is posuerunt. That's a form of the verb pono, which means to put or place. Posuerunt is perfect tense, so it means they put or they placed, and castra is the direct object. That's accusative plural. It means camp. And when we have castra and pono together, we translate it as to pitch camp. So our subject, verb, and direct object will say, the soldiers pitched camp. Now we have an adjective here, a participle, modifying milites, and that is the participle traducti. Traducti is a form of the verb transduco, well, really traduco. For some reason, the N and the S in trans go away, and you get traduco. So it's really just trans, and then the verb duco. The 4 principal parts of duco are duco, ducere, duxi, ductum. D-U-C-T is the base that we form the perfect passive participle from. Remember that the perfect passive participle declines like a first and second declension adjective. So if we want it to agree with milites, which is nominative plural, we need to make traducti nominative plural. Okay, if it were singular, it would be traductus. If it were singular feminine, it would be traducta. If it were neuter, singular, it would be traductum. Here it's nominative plural masculine. So we put the nominative plural masculine ending on it and we get traducti. So traducti is modifying milites. And so the word traducti shows that the soldiers in the past experienced passively the activity of being led across or led over something. So we can render that into English by using the words having and been. We could say having been led over, or perhaps having been led across. We have a prepositional phrase, trans renum, that means across the Rhine. Notice that really the word trans here is present twice, once as the prefix of the verb traduco, and then again as a separate preposition. So literally it says something like, having been led across the Rhine. It's like you have the word across there twice. Okay, so number 1 says, the soldiers, having been led across the Rhine, or having been led over the Rhine, pitched camp. Again, traducti is a perfect passive participle from the verb traduco, modifying milites. Number 2 is next. Filia principis ab hostibus capta ad castra ducebatur. The subject here is filia, which means daughter, and the verb is ducebatur, which is a form of the verb duco, which means lead. Ducebatur is imperfect tense, third person singular, passive. So ducebatur says he, she, or it was being led. So the subject and verb together say, the daughter was being led. Filia is being possessed by the genitive noun principis. That's genitive singular. So filia principis says the daughter of the chief. Ad castra says to the camp. So the daughter of the chief was being led to the camp. And now we have ab hostibus capta. The word capta is a perfect passive participle. It's from one of our recent verbs, capio, which is a third conjugation io verb. It means to take or capture. So the four principal parts are capio, capere, capi, captum. Okay, so C-A-P-T is the base or the stem from which we make the different forms of the perfect passive participle. So if capta were masculine singular, it would be captus. Here it's feminine singular, so it's capta. If it were neuter, it would be captum. So it declines just like a first and second declension adjective. Here it's feminine because it's modifying the feminine noun philia, which means daughter. And so the word capta communicates that somebody in the past passively experienced the activity of being taken or captured. So we can render that into English by saying, having been captured. When we say that, it shows that the activity took place in the past. It shows that the activity was experienced passively. And so that's what the perfect passive participle communicates. Ab hostibus is an ablative of agent. It says, by the enemies. Hostibus is ablative plural. In Latin, when you have a passive verb, you can use the preposition a or ab plus the ablative to show by whom the activity was performed. That's called an ablative of agent. And that's what we have here. Ab hostibus is showing by whom the passive activity of capturing was performed. So we'll translate ab hostibus capta as having been captured by the enemies. Of course, we'll translate hostibus in a collective way and say by the enemy. So number 2 says this, the daughter of the chief, having been captured by the enemy, was being led to the camp. So any place you can use an adjective, you can use a perfect passive participle because it is an adjective. Let's move on now to section 276, and let's talk about the ablative absolute. What is an ablative absolute, and why does it have that name? Why is it called that? An ablative absolute is a special kind of phrase in Latin that uses the ablative case to show the circumstances surrounding some kind of situation. The ablative absolute allows a writer or speaker to say what kind of circumstances are going on along with the main activity of the sentence. So it shows circumstances. The name of it, ablative absolute, has 2 parts. The first part is ablative. It's called the ablative absolute because it uses the ablative case. That's simple enough. Our English word absolute comes from Latin roots, as you might guess. And where it really comes from is the verb solvo, S-O-L-V-O. That's where we get our English word solvent from. And solvo in Latin can mean things like to loosen, or to untie, or free, or release. It can mean actually several things. It can mean to dissolve or break up. Probably that's why we get the English word solvent from it, because solvent can be used to break up some kind of substance. But the basic meaning is to untie or free. And the fourth principal part is solutum, and that's where we get our English word solution from, probably because of the meaning of solvo that has to do with dissolving, because I believe it's when you dissolve a solid into a liquid. So the perfect passive participle form, solutus, soluta, solutum. And if you put the preposition ab on the front, you get absolutum, absolutus. The literal meaning of the word absolute is that it is freed off from something. In other words, it's not dependent on other things or connected to other things. It's freed off or unbound off or from other things. Let's say you're in a debate and you say something and you say, this is an absolute truth. What you mean is that it's true whether or not it's connected to anything. It doesn't rely on anything else to make it true. It's just true on its own. It's not a relative truth. It's true in relationship to something. It's absolute in the sense that it's freed off from anything else. And that's the meaning that we have here when we say ablative absolute, because an ablative absolute is not grammatically connected to anything else in the sentence. It's a freestanding phrase. And so as the word absolute suggests, it's freed off or unbounded from the rest of the sentence. So an ablative absolute is ablative because it uses the ablative case, but it's absolute because it's separate and freestanding within the sentence. It doesn't interact or interconnect grammatically with anything else in the sentence. So how do we make this little freestanding ablative statement that shows circumstances? How do we do that? Well, let's start reading in section 276. It says here, an ablative absolute is a phrase consisting of a noun or pronoun in the ablative and a participle, an adjective, or another noun in agreement with it. So there are different flavors of ablative absolute. If you look at the top of page 103, well, let's just read it together. It says 1, a noun or pronoun plus a participle. And that's probably the most common kind of ablative absolute that you will see in Latin texts. Again, both of those will be in the ablative case. Number 2 is less common, a noun plus an adjective, or a pronoun plus an adjective. You see it occasionally, but not quite as often. Number 3 says a noun or pronoun plus a noun. You see that a lot when they try to tell you who the consul is in a certain year. So you do see that occasionally. So an ablative absolute is a noun or pronoun plus something, plus a participle, plus an adjective, or another noun. So it basically consists of 2 words most of the time, both of which are in the ablative case. And again, this little phrase shows circumstances. I've been told that one textbook, maybe Allen and Greenough, I can't remember which one it is, one textbook calls it the ablative of attendant circumstances, which is actually a pretty good name, probably better than ablative absolute. Again, it's usually a 2-word phrase with 2 words in the ablative case that show you some kind of circumstances that are going on. And so now in section B of section 276, you can see that the ablative absolute can communicate different things. It can communicate timing. It can tell you the reason something happened. It can carry with it the idea of concession, as in, although such and such happened, and it can carry the idea of a condition. Those are more subtle things to look for once we've gotten the basic idea of how the ablative absolute works. So let's circle back around to that in a moment. So for right now, let's just move on ahead to section 277, and let's start to examine some ablative absolutes in their natural habitat. That is, in Latin, in the context of some kind of sentence. So here in section 277, we have 5 different examples of them, and you'll notice that each one consists of 2 words, both in the ablative case. So let's take a look at number 1. Number 1 says, proilio facto. Proilio is a form of the noun proilium, which means battle. That's a second declension neuter noun. And then facto is a form of the verb facio, which means to do or make. The 4 principal parts, facio, facere, faci, factum. So as you can see, facto here is a perfect passive participle form of the verb facio. And as you can see, also, it's agreeing with proilio. So both proilio and facto are ablative, neuter, and singular. Facto agrees with proilio because it's an adjective modifying it. Remember, participles are adjectives. So in its simplest form, proilio and facto together say something like, the battle made or the battle done. Facto, because it's the perfect passive participle of facio, it tells us that in the past, the activity of doing or making was passively done to the battle. The battle was made, or the battle was done. So we can render that into English by saying the battle made or the battle done. Or we can add a couple of words in. We can say having been. We can say the battle having been done or the battle having been made. The authors of the book are taking a little bit of liberty with that. They're saying the battle having been fought. Faccio does not mean really to fight, literally. So they're just sort of filling out that meaning of it. If we want to keep it literal, it's the battle having been made or the battle having been done. So we've identified the bare meanings of proelium and factum. It means battle, and it means having been done or having been made. Now, how do we put it all together so that it expresses the meaning of an ablative absolute? Okay, they're both ablative singular, and so we know it's an ablative absolute. Keep in mind that what an ablative absolute expresses is circumstances. It tells you the circumstances under which something is happening. Sometimes you'll see it at the beginning of a sentence, and it sets up the circumstances under which, the rest of the sentence happens. So how do we render it into English that it's showing us circumstances? Well, we can throw the word with in there. We can say, with the battle having been made, or with the battle having been done. That's an easy way to do it. In fact, when I was in high school, that's how my high school Latin teacher taught us to translate an ablative absolute. With the word with, it helps to communicate that that situation is the circumstance or the background, if you will, against which the rest of the sentence is happening. So we could do it that way, or we could leave out even the word with and just say the battle having been fought, and then that sets up the circumstances for the rest of the sentence. So I hope that at this point you're starting to see why it's called an absolute. Again, the word absolute means it's freed off from the rest of the sentence, and so it's an independent, freestanding little phrase. It's a two-word phrase that can function by itself as a way to set up the circumstances. One last thing before we move on, the authors of the book would like us to notice that the shade of meaning here, the finer shade of meaning that's being expressed by this ablative absolute is one of timing. And they give you a couple of words here like when and after. The feeling I get from proelio facto is that it's after the battle has been done or made. Again, the authors of the book are translating it as the battle having been fought. So in addition to the bare, stripped down meaning of the ablative absolute, also try to see the finer shade of what it's trying to communicate. Is it communicating time, cause, concession, etc.? And by the way, it's not always easy to do. The main thing I'd like you to learn right now is just how to translate them in general, not so much getting the exact fine shade of meaning. I think that is something that you can get better at over time as you gain more experience. Anyway, let's go on to number 2, nostris succedentibus. Here we have an ablative absolute in the plural. Nostris is ablative plural. That's a form of the adjective noster, nostra, nostrum, which means our. I've mentioned before that the way Julius Caesar uses this adjective, our, is as a substantive to mean our troops, our soldiers, our men, things like that. And then we have succedentibus. That is a present tense participle, a present active participle, and the footnote tells us what it is. It's from the verb succedo, which is sub plus cedo. Cedo means to go or move. So the 4 principal parts are succedo, succedere, successi, successum. So it means to advance. And so succedentibus is a third declension ablative plural form of the present participle. That would be succedens in the nominative singular. So if somebody is succedens, it means that that person is advancing. So the bare meaning here of nostris succedentibus is our guys advancing, or our men advancing, or our soldiers advancing. But since it's ablative, and it's an ablative absolute, it's telling us circumstances. It's saying under the circumstances that our men are advancing. What could the finer shade of meaning be? Well, they give us several different options. They have because our men are advancing, since our men are advancing, while our men are advancing. Again, the word with is just kind of an all-purpose way to render an ablative absolute. If you want to have just a very simple way to render an ablative absolute, you could just say with. So we could say, with our men advancing. Granted, that way of translating it is not very specific, and it does not capture the finer shade of meaning. It doesn't really capture time or cause or concession. That's why it can be a good way to teach young people how to do it, like high school students. It's just a way for them to get started working with the ablative absolute. So for a plain, simple way to translate it, you could say, with our men advancing. And if you want to be more fancy schmancy about it and get the finer shade of meaning, you could say, because our men are advancing, or when our men are advancing, something like that. If you think that you can really sense some kind of finer shade of meaning that particular ablative absolute is trying to communicate. Let's go on to number 3, paucis defendentibus. Here we have the adjective paucis. That's a form of the first and second declension adjective. Paucus, pauca, paucum, which means few. We have our English word paucity, and that word means scantiness or lack of something, perhaps rarity. Anyway, here it's being used as a substantive. And then we have defendentibus. That's another present participle, a present active participle, that is, this time of the verb defendo. In the nominative singular, it would be defendens. In the genitive singular, it would be defendentis. Here it's ablative plural, so it's defendentibus. Paucis and defendentibus together, in the ablative plural, they form an ablative absolute telling us circumstances. So we could keep it very simple and just use the word with. We could say, with few defending, or we could even leave out the word with and say, few defending, comma, and then put a comma to show that that's sort of its own unit there. So that's kind of a simple, stripped down way to translate it. If you want to capture the finer shade of meaning, you could say, well, the idea here is even though few are defending, we held out against the enemy. Maybe that's what the sentence is saying. And so it has the feeling of concession to it. Concession, that kind of sentence, means that it's going to have the idea of although this is happening, we still did that. That's what's being said by the word concession. You're conceding that something is the case. So a simple translation could be, with few defending, or a more nuanced translation could be, although few are defending. Again, it's not always easy to find the finer shade of meaning that's being communicated by the ablative absolute. Let's move on to number 4, data facultate. Here we have the words in reverse order. Here we have the participle first, and then the noun. Facultate is a form of the third declension noun facultas, which means opportunity. You can see it's ablative singular, and it's feminine, so the perfect passive participle here agreeing with it is also feminine. So data is a form of the verb do, which means give. The 4 principal parts, do, dare, dedi, datum. This is where we get our English word data, like computer data. It's data because it's things that have been given. In my mind, in the context of information that's been provided. But here, data is a perfect passive participle, of the verb do, which means give. So data means given. So facultate and data, together those two words in the ablative singular, make an ablative absolute, showing us circumstances. So for an easy way to translate them, we could throw in the word with and say, with an opportunity having been given. Or, with an opportunity given, we could even strip it down more. Or we could even leave out the word with and just say, an opportunity given, comma. As far as the finer shade of meaning goes, the authors of the book want us to see this as conditional. In other words, they want us to read it as saying if an opportunity should be given. I would say that we don't really know that that's what it's going to say because we don't have any context for the sentence. This ablative absolute here isn't really part of a sentence. It's just here as an exercise. But in the kind of sentence that has that kind of flavor of meaning, yes, it could mean that. But again, a simple way to translate it is just with the word with an opportunity having been given. Number 5 is next. Caesare invito. Here we have an ablative absolute that is comprised of a noun and an adjective. All the others we've studied so far, 1, 2, 3, and 4, they all consisted of a noun or a substantive along with some kind of participle. Now in 5 and 6, we're going to see a couple of different kinds of ablative absolute. This particular one, number 5, consists of a noun and an adjective. Invitus is a first and second declension adjective that means unwilling. Invitus, invita, invitum. And then Caesare is the ablative singular form of Julius Caesar's name. Caesare and invito are both masculine, ablative, and singular. So these two ablatives together form an ablative absolute that is telling us circumstances. So we can translate it with the word with and just say, with Caesar unwilling, or even leave out the word with and say, Caesar unwilling, comma, put a comma there so it has its own separateness to it. But regardless of how you translate it, the idea is that those are the circumstances under which the sentence is happening, okay? It's under the circumstances that Caesar is unwilling. Finally, in number 6, we get an ablative absolute that consists of a noun and another noun. Messala consule. Messala is someone's name, and then consule is the ablative singular form of the word consul, which is the head of state in ancient Rome. That is during the ancient Roman Republic. Consul is nominative singular. Consule is ablative singular. And then Messala is a man's name. Despite the fact that it's masculine, it declines like a first declension noun. So it's a first declension masculine. Notice the macron over the A there. So Messala and consule are both ablative singular. Together they form an ablative absolute, telling us the circumstances. The idea here is that it's under the circumstances that Messala is the consul. Again, we can translate it with the word with. We could say with Messala as consul, or like they have it here in the book, Messala being consul. Or if you want to have a less literal translation, you could say when Messala was consul. Or you could even say during the consulship of Messala. Any of those things communicates what's being said. The idea is that it's under the circumstances that Messala is the consul. Going back for a moment to section 276, part B, it says, an ablative absolute often denotes one of the following ideas: time, cause, concession, or condition. My advice to you would be to translate ablative absolutes as simply as possible, if at all possible with the word with. And if you can notice some kind of finer shade of meaning, go ahead and give it a try. Try to capture the finer shade of meaning, but keep in mind that it can be a challenge, and just do the best you can if you really sense it. But don't feel bad if you can't do it. Don't feel bad if you simply stick with the word with, like with the battle having been made, or with our men advancing, or with few defending. It's okay to do it that way. So start with that as sort of a base translation, and then experiment with trying to find the finer shade of meaning. If you sense that that's what the context is, if you sense that that's what it's really communicating. Let's turn the page to page 104, and they have some good advice for us here. It says, notice that these phrases, when translated literally, as in the parentheses, are equivalent to the English nominative absolute. So we do the same thing in English, except in English we don't have the ablative case. For us it's the nominative case, because really we don't even have many cases in English. We just basically have nominative and accusative. Sometimes in English we set up a sentence with circumstances, just like they do in Latin. But anyway, what they're saying here is, to continue on, but it will be found that this is usually not the best equivalent. It is often better to translate by a clause beginning with when, since, or if, the proper word being determined only by the thought of the sentence. So again, what is being taught here is that they want you to get the context of the sentence and measure how the ablative absolute is fitting into the context of the sentence, and if it's warranted to start it out with a word like when or since or if. Again, it's not always easy to do, and I think it's something that you can improve at with practice. So just do the best you can with that. Okay, let's move on to section 278, and let's talk a bit more about how the perfect passive participle is used in Latin. Near the beginning of this lesson, I mentioned the fact that Latin and English, for that matter, both do not have a perfect active participle. They both have perfect passive participles, but not active ones. So let's take, for example, the verb paint. Okay, we talked about a painted fence as an example. If I say the fence is painted, that's a perfect passive participle. The word painted says that the fence passively experienced the act of painting in the past, and the act of painting is now complete. So all that meaning is packed into the word painted. Again, in English, perfect passive participles often have the ending ed. Not always, but oftentimes. So we have a way to say that something passively was painted in the past. We have a way to say that with just one word, the word painted. So that's passive. What we do not have is one word that is just a one-word participle that is the active version of that. There's no word that says having painted. It takes two words to say that. If I say having painted, that shows that the action was done in the past, but it was not done passively, it was done actively. So both in English and in Latin, we have a word that is a perfect passive participle, and it just says all that with one word, but we don't have the active version of that. In English, at least, to do that, we have to throw in the word having and other helper words, perhaps. So in Latin, because we don't have a perfect active participle, it means that when they want to express action that happened in the past as a participle, they're pretty much just stuck with the perfect passive participle. That's all they have to do that. So let's take a look at the example sentence here at the beginning of section 278. Look at the English part of it. It says, having subdued the Helvetians, Caesar fought with the Germans. Having and subdued, those two words are taking the place of a perfect active participle. Again, we don't have one word to express that. We have to use more than one word because we don't have a perfect active participle. So let's say that you're a Latin writer, an ancient Roman historian, and you want to write, having subdued the Helvetians. You can't write it like that because you don't have a perfect active participle. So you make do with what you have, which is the perfect passive participle. So you have to word it in such a way where the activity was experienced passively. And so look at the words Helvetiis pakatis. That's an ablative absolute. Helvetiis, well, that's the name of the Helvetians, and it's ablative plural. Pakatis is from the verb pako, which means to subdue. The four principal parts are pako, pakare, pakawi, pakatum. So the perfect passive participle, having been subdued, would be pakatus, pakata, pakatum. And it declines like a first and second declension adjective. Pakatis is ablative plural. It agrees with helvetiis. And so together, those two words form an ablative absolute that says the helvetii having been subdued. Notice that it's passive because that's all you have for perfect tense participles in Latin. So if you want to say having subdued, and you want to say that in Latin, you can't. You have to say with the helvetii having been subdued. You have to word it passively with a perfect passive participle. So let's read the first line of the main paragraph here. It says, Latin, having no active perfect participle, very often uses the passive in place of it, as in the illustration. So the main point that we want you to understand here is that there is no perfect active participle. So in Latin, you have to use the perfect passive participle to say those kinds of things. You have to just word it with a passive participle because that's what you have. So instead of saying that somebody subdued actively, you say that the helvetii were subdued. You say it passively with the perfect passive participle. Now there is an exception to this rule. If you look down at the bottom of section 278, you'll see where it says, note, the perfect participle of deponent verbs, blah, blah, blah. I would like you to ignore that for now. We have not studied deponent verbs yet, really. And so before we get there, I want you to just understand, for the moment, in the short term, understand that Latin does not have a perfect active participle. We'll talk more about that later. We'll circle back around to it in a future lesson. Okay, quick review. We have a one-word participle that says, having been subdued passively, that's pakatus, but there is no corresponding active form that says, having subdued in Latin. That's the key point here. Okay, moving on to section 279, it simply restates what I've been telling you the whole time. A noun or pronoun in the ablative with a noun, adjective, or participle in agreement with it may form an ablative absolute. A bit more quick review there. Okay, let's look at our vocabulary here. That's section 280. We have a first declension feminine noun, inopia, which means scarcity. There's a noun from the third declension, which is ops, and the genitive singular is opus, O-P-I-S. And in the plural, that noun can mean resources. So here what we have is that root word negated with in. So ops, opus means resources, and then in the front means no resources. You don't have resources. So that's why it means scarcity. Praesidium, our next word, also has two parts to it. We have the pri part, which means in front of. That's where we get our English prefix pre. Actually, it's the prefix of the word prefix, the pre part. And then sidium, that root word there means to sit. It's from the verb sedeo. So literally it means to sit in front of somebody. So here as a noun, it has to do with guard in the sense of if you have some soldiers guarding something, that's a praesidium. Next we have allobroges. That's a tribe of Gauls. And as you can see, that's a third declension noun. The genitive plural ends with so that's a third declension. We have a few new verbs here. Accuso, accusare, accusavi, accusatum, which means accuse. That's a first conjugation verb. Expecto, also first conjugation. Specto means to watch, and ex means out or out of. So if you're watching out of someplace, maybe you're watching the horizon, looking out for somebody. In that sense, you're expecting them or waiting for them. Moving to the top of page 105, per moeo. That's another compound verb. It's the verb moeo, which means move, with the prefix per. And per, when it's prefixed to a verb, can mean through, or it can mean to do something strongly or thoroughly. And that's apparently what we have here. Per moeo means to move something thoroughly, in the sense of influence, in the sense of influencing someone's behavior. The four principal parts of moeo are moeo, moere, moi, motum. And as you can see from the fourth principal part there, motum, that's where we get English words like motion or motor. So that's a second conjugation verb. Next we have adduco. We've already seen some verbs that are duco with a prefix. Of course, duco means to lead. Duco, ducere, duxi, ductum. That's a third conjugation verb. We get English words like duct, and lots of words that are compounded with prepositions like conduct, induct, product, all kinds of things like that. So here we have duco with the preposition ad. Ad duco, literally to lead to, but with the meaning of induce. Also induco. And the reason we're learning these words that have to do with influence and induce is that Caesar likes to portray the Celts, that is the Gauls, as stirring each other up, rousing each other to action. He likes to portray them as fickle and prone to quick political action. In fact, this is kind of a trope in Roman literature. Non-Romans are often portrayed as people who are impulsive and unable to restrain themselves. Caesar, throughout the Gallic Wars, he likes to describe these different tribes as being influenced or led to things or stirred up to do things. So that's the kind of context in which you'll see these words. Next we have dyspono. That's the verb pono, which means to put or place. The prefix dis can be thought of as meaning in all directions. So if you have some soldiers and you dyspono them, you put them in all directions, it means you're stationing them around. Next we have jungo, the four principal parts, jungo, jungere, junxi, junctum. That's a third conjugation verb, and it means to join. You may remember a couple of lessons ago I mentioned the etymology of the word conjunction, and I mentioned this particular verb, if I remember correctly. So con means together or with, and then jungo means join. So if you say con jungo, that means join together. Added to the fourth principal part, conjunctum, you can see where our English word conjunction comes from. Because a conjunction is a word like and that joins two parts of a sentence together, or joins two words together. Next we have trado, which is the verb do with the preposition trans. So literally to give across or give over. It's similar to the verb traduco in that the letter N and the letter S go away. And so instead of trans, you just get TRA. Instead of transdo, you get trado. We have English words related to this verb like tradition, because a tradition is something that's handed to you. But in this context, here it will mean give up or surrender. Okay, let's move on to section 281. That's our translation section for this lesson. So turn off the recording and do all the exercises here in section 281. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've done your homework here in section 281. Let's go over them together, starting with number 1. Number 1 is an ablative absolute. Regno occupato. Both of these words are in the ablative singular. First we have the word regno, which is a form of the second declension neuter noun, regnum. Regnum is often translated as kingdom, but as I sometimes mention, it's often better translated as kingship because it means the right to rule, not so much a place you rule over, although it can mean that too, I think. Next, we have the verb occupato. That's a form of the verb occupo, which means to seize or take possession of. That's a first conjugation verb, occupo, occupare, occupavi, occupatum. And so now we're getting to the perfect passive participle, which will be occupatus, occupata, occupatum. Being a perfect passive participle, we'll translate those words as having been seized. So a regno occupato is a kingship that has been seized. Okay, so as an ablative absolute here, we could throw in the word with and say, with the kingship having been seized. Or we could say, with the kingship seized. Or we could say, the kingship seized, comma. So there are different ways to do it, depending on how many extra words you want to use. You could do sort of a cut-down version of it, or you could add in a few words like with or having been. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you capture the literal meaning of what the Latin is saying. So for number one, we could say, the kingship having been seized. Notice the footnote here. It says, translate by a clause expressing time. The finer shade of meaning here, they're trying to guide us toward something that refers to time. So we could throw in the word after and say, after the kingship was seized. So that's how we could make this ablative absolute refer to timing. But again, I think you would need some context to do that. Here we don't really have any context, except for a footnote telling us to do that. Let's move on to number two. Here we have another ablative absolute, hoc proelio nuntiato. Here we have an ablative absolute consisting of three words instead of the usual two. Proelium is a second declension neuter noun that means battle. And so proelio is ablative singular. Hoc is the ablative singular neuter form of hic, haec, hoc, and it means this. So hoc and proelio together say this battle. And then nuntiato is a form of the verb nuntio, which means to announce or report. That's a first conjugation verb, nuntio, nuntiare, nuntiave, nuntiatum. So for our perfect passive participle, we'd have nuntiatus, nuntiata, nuntiatum. So if something is nuntiato, that means it's been announced. So we can translate nuntiato as having been reported or having been announced. So we could translate number two like this. We could say, this battle having been reported. But now take a look at the footnote. Footnote number one again says that they want us to try to give it a finer shade of meaning, referring to time. So again, we could throw in some kind of timing-related word like after. For me personally, the word that I'm inclined to add here is the word after, because the action of a perfect passive participle is completed in the past. So that suggests that something is after something. So for number two, we could say, after this battle was reported, or something like that. But at its most basic meaning, number two says, the battle having been reported. One last note here before we leave number two. If the participle here, nuntiato, had been present tense, like nuntianti or something like that, then that shows you that the action is currently happening. So with that, I would be more inclined to want to put in the word while because it's present tense. But again, with it being perfect tense, a perfect passive participle, nuntiato, that inclines me to want to render a time scheme using the word after because the action's already complete. Number three is next. Armis traditis. Okay, first we have armis. It's really the second declension neuter noun arma, which is neuter plural. It means weaponry, arms, weapons. So here in the ablative plural, it's armis. So that's a second declension neuter. And then traditis is a form of the verb trado. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson. Trado, tradere, tradidi, traditum. And that means give up or surrender. So as you can see, traditis is a perfect passive participle. We can translate it as having been given up, having been surrendered. So number 3 is an ablative absolute. The arms having been surrendered, or the weapons having been surrendered, something like that. Again, the perfect passive participle shows that the action was done in the past. It was experienced passively by somebody or something. In this case, the weapons were the things being surrendered. So the most stripped down or bare way we could translate this would be with the arms having been surrendered, or simply the arms having been surrendered. But there's a footnote, number 2. It says they want us to translate it with a finer shade of meaning, in this case, communicating condition. So if you're reading some kind of Latin sentence and you get the feeling that this is expressing some kind of circumstance that is not actual action, but it's in the context of some imagined situation, it could express a condition. It could say something like, if the arms have been surrendered. Again, you would need context to do that. Moving on to number 4, Galli hac oratione adducti conjurationem faciunt. A few moments ago, I mentioned that Julius Caesar, and other Roman historians for that matter, they like to portray barbarians in a certain light. They like to portray them as easily influenced, easily stirred up to action, unable to restrain themselves, impulsive, eager for changes in their government. And so this is an example of a sentence that's like that. You'll see this kind of sentence in Caesar's Gallic Wars. Okay, the subject here is Galli, that's the Gauls. And then faciunt is the verb. That's present tense, third person plural of the verb facio. So the subject and verb here are the Gauls make or the Gauls do. The direct object is conjurationem. That means conspiracy. That's third declension accusative singular of the noun conjuratio. Okay, so number 4, subject, verb, and direct object says the Gauls make a conspiracy or the Gauls do a conspiracy. Now we have a perfect passive participle modifying Galli. Remember that a participle is an adjective. So adducti is an adjective modifying Galli. Notice that they're both masculine, nominative, and plural. Adducti is a form of one of our new verbs for this lesson, which is adduco, and so that means to induce. Adductus, adducta, adductum, those would be the different forms of this first and second declension adjective. The meaning of those participles would be having been induced, or more simply, just induced. The activity of a perfect passive participle is activity that's happened in the past. It's activity that's been completed in the past, and it's finished. And it's activity that was experienced passively by someone or something. So here the Gauls, in the past, experienced the activity passively of being induced. What we have so far would say the Gauls, having been induced, are making a conspiracy. And finally, we have hac oratione. That's an ablative of means, showing the means by which they were induced. So oratio is a third declension noun that means speech. Here it's in the ablative singular, oratione. The genitive singular would be orationis. And oratio is feminine, so it's being accompanied by a form of hic haec hoc, which is feminine, ablative, and singular. That's hac. Notice the macron over the A. So that's the feminine singular ablative form of hic haec hoc. So hac and oratione together say this speech But since they're ablative, they're communicating by means of this speech. It's an ablative of means. Remember that when you're showing who did something with the ablative, if it's an inanimate object, you can just use a bare ablative to show ablative of means. If it's a human being doing it, you have to use a or ab to make an ablative of agent. So here a speech is an inanimate object. So we don't need a or ab. We can just use a straight ablative, and it's an ablative of means. Again, notice that both hoc and oratione are ablative singular and feminine. They agree with each other. Okay, so number 4 says, the Gauls, having been induced by this speech, are making a conspiracy. Or we could leave out the words having and been and just say, the Gauls, induced by this speech, are making a conspiracy. Number 5 is next. Eo opere perfecto, Caesar praesidia disponit. At the beginning here, we have an ablative absolute consisting of the words eo opere and perfecto. Then we have the main part of the sentence. Remember that the word absolute means freed off. So the eo opere and perfecto, they are separate from the rest of the sentence. They show you the circumstances, but they're not grammatically connected to anything. It's a freestanding part of the sentence. So the main part of the sentence really is Caesar praesidia and disponit. Caesar is the subject. He's nominative singular. And then disponit is one of our new verbs for this lesson. That's dyspono, disponere. And it means to station, like to station soldiers in places. Praesidia is the accusative plural form of the second declension noun praesidium. Praesidium is actually one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. And it means guard, not in the sense of a single soldier guarding something or like a single security guard, but it has a broader meaning than that. It means defense or perhaps security. It could be like a group of soldiers guarding something. If this were referring to one single person, like a guard, it would probably not be neuter. Neuter is more for inanimate objects. So you see the word praesidium can mean a group of soldiers guarding something, or it can mean the place where they are guarding something, like a fortification, a guard post. Praesidium has to do with the concept of guarding, not just one person who does the guarding. So we can translate praesidia here as defenses, fortifications, posts, anything like that. So let's translate Caesar praesidia disponit as Caesar is stationing the defenses. Now back to our ablative absolute that starts out the sentence, eo opere perfecto. The word opere is a form of the third declension neuter noun, which is opus. You may have heard of this noun used to describe a great work of art, like a great composition, musical composition, or perhaps a distinctive work of literature that someone wrote during their life. It might be called their magnum opus. So the word opus means work, not in the sense of the act of working, but the product of work. So in English, if you say, I did work, that's not exactly what it means. It doesn't mean the effort of work. It means the product of work. For example, in the phrase work of fiction or work of art, that's what opus means. In a military context, it could mean a fortification, some kind of completed work in the sense of an earthwork or fortification work, something like that. There's another word from the first declension, which is, I believe, the word opera, and that means work in the sense of effort, like the actual act of work. But this third declension noun means the product of work. Okay, so here, opus is ablative singular. Genitive singular would be operis, and since it's neuter, the nominative plural form would be opera. Accusative plural would be opera. Okay, and it has along with it here eo, which is a form of is ea id. Remember the demonstrative that we studied a while back? It can mean things like this, that, he, she, it. It can mean a kind of a variety of things depending on the context. Here we can translate it simply as this. Notice that eo is ablative, singular, and neuter to match opere. Eo and opere together say this work. And then perfecto is a perfect passive participle. That's a form of the verb perficio, which means to accomplish, finish, things like that. It's really just the verb facio with per attached to the front of it. As a perfect passive participle, the word perfecto communicates that something in the past was accomplished and it experienced the accomplishing passively. In other words, it was finished or it was accomplished. So we could translate perfecto simply as finished or accomplished, or we could add a couple of words and say having been accomplished or having been finished. They mean the same thing. Eo, opere, and perfecto, those three words form an ablative absolute. We could translate it several ways. We could say this work having been finished, this work having been completed. We could throw in the word with and say with this work having been completed. So you get the idea of how we could translate it. But there's one other thing to consider here. Well, two things really. Let's take a look at the footnote. That's footnote number 3. What does it say? It says, translate by a clause expressing time, or see section 278. It seems to me that if we simply render the ablative absolute as this work having been completed, that expresses enough of a time scheme that we don't have to include extra words like after. So we could say this. This work having been completed, Caesar is stationing the defenses. In English, when you say this work having been completed, it's pretty clear that the action has already been done. So we could just leave it like that. Or we could say the word after. We could say something like, after the work was completed, Caesar is stationing the defenses. But that doesn't really sound all that great because we're mixing tenses. We have past tense in the first part of the sentence, and then present tense in the second part of the sentence. We could throw in the word already and say something like, with this work already having been completed, Caesar is stationing the defenses. That works okay. But even if we just say, this work having been completed, Caesar is stationing the defenses, if we just say it like that, it's pretty clear that the stationing of defenses is happening after the work is completed. Sometimes it can be kind of a challenge to render the Latin literally while making it sound smooth in English. Sometimes the smoother you make it sound in English, the less literal of a translation it is. For students, I try to err on the side of being literal so that they're not confused about what the actual Latin is saying. That having been said, the footnote suggests that we look at section 278. And what do they suggest in section 278? A non-literal translation for the ablative absolute. In our ablative absolute, we have a passive participle. Perfecto is a perfect passive participle. But in section 278, the authors of the book suggest that sometimes for smoothness, you can flip it around and make the participle active in your translation. So in the ablative absolute, the activity is being viewed from the point of the work. The work is passively experiencing the activity of being completed. It's passive, and the thing being completed is the work. So if it were a full sentence, the work would be the subject. To make a smooth-sounding English translation, however, we can flip it around and make it sound like someone is actively doing the action of finishing the work. So we could translate it as having finished this work. So when we do that, it's not literal. We're changing things around. We're doing some hocus pocus. We're making the participle sound active and we're turning the work into the direct object. In the original Latin, the work is the passive subject of the passive activity of being finished. It's not a direct object of anything. So if we say, having finished this work, Caesar is stationing the defenses. If we do that, it makes it sound like Caesar is actively doing the activity of finishing or completing something. So a literal translation of number 5 is this. This work having been completed, Caesar is stationing the defenses. A non-literal translation, in which we change around the voice of what's happening in the Ablative Absolute, and we make Caesar the active subject there, that would sound like this. Having completed this work, Caesar is stationing the defenses. Now, I will admit that does sound pretty good in English because it doesn't mix tenses together. If we say the work having been completed and then switch to the present tense for Caesar, that can be a little awkward. But if we make Caesar the subject of both the ablative absolute part of the sentence and the main part of the sentence, that actually sounds pretty good in English because it's connecting everything together. Caesar is the subject of both parts. So for a translator, you can see the appeal of that kind of translation. It makes a kind of a smooth, connected kind of English translation, even though it's not literal. Okay, let's move on to number 6. Helvetii navibus junctis flumen transeunt. The subject here is Helvetii. The verb is transeunt. That's a verb that consists of the verb eo, which means go, and the preposition trans. Okay, so trans eo means to go across. It's a compound verb. And so transeunt is third person plural present tense. So Helvetii and transeunt are saying the Helvetii are going across. Or we could simply say the Helvetii are crossing. And then flumen is the direct object. That's accusative. It's a neuter noun of the third declension. So the Helvetii are crossing the river, and that leaves us with this ablative absolute, navibus junctis. The word navibus is a form of the third declension noun navis, which means ship. Here it's ablative plural. And then junctis is a form of the verb jungo. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson, jungo, jungere, junxi, junctum. So you can see that the word junctis is a perfect passive participle of the verb jungo. So the word junctis is ablative plural because it has to agree with navibus. Again, navibus and junctis form an ablative absolute. So junctis can say things like having been joined or simply joined. So with this perfect passive participle, the activity of joining has happened in the past, and the activity of joining is complete, and the activity of joining has been experienced by someone or something passively. Okay, so it's a perfect passive participle, therefore meaning joined or having been joined. Along with navibus, which means ships, it says the ships having been joined. Again, this is an ablative absolute. It tells us circumstances that are sort of the backdrop of the sentence. So we could translate number 6 like this. The ships having been joined, the Helvetii are crossing the river. Or we could throw in the word with and say, with the ships having been joined, the Helvetii are crossing the river. That works fine too. Notice, though, that we have footnote 5 here. And again, it's pointing us to section 278, in which they invite us to render this ablative absolute in an active kind of way. The participle junctis is a passive participle. You know, it's a perfect passive participle, but we can try to translate it in an active kind of way. We can say, having joined the ships. So when we do that, we're taking the activity described by junctis and we're transferring it from passive to active. We're making someone do it in an active way. And then we make the ships into a direct object. So let's see what it sounds like. Having joined the ships, the Helvetii are crossing the river. That's actually a nice, smooth translation. When we do it that way, it makes it sound like the Helvetii are the ones who joined the ships. It makes them the party that's doing the action described in the Ablative Absolute. Instead of having the ships as a passive subject of the passive participle, it makes it active. It makes the Helvetii active agents in joining the ships. So a literal translation for number 6 would say, the ships having been joined, the Helvetii are crossing the river. But for a non-literal translation, the way it's described in section 278, it would sound like this. The Helvetii, having joined the ships, are crossing the river. Number 7 is next. Nostri signo dato impetum fecerunt. Here we have yet another ablative absolute, signo and dato, but we can leave it out completely in our initial translation because as an ablative absolute, it doesn't interact grammatically with anything else in the sentence. So the main clause here is nostri impetum fecerunt. Nostri is the subject. That means our soldiers, our troops. We've discussed that several times in the past. Fecerunt is a perfect tense form of the verb facio. It's third person plural, so it means they made or they did. And impetum means attack. That's the accusative singular form of a noun from the fourth declension, which is impetus. So our subject, verb, and direct object altogether say, our troops made an attack. That leaves us with signo and dato, an ablative absolute. Signo is the ablative singular form of signum, a second declension neuter noun that means signal or sign. And dato is a form of the verb do, which means give. Do, dare, dedi, datum. So you can see that dato is a perfect passive participle of do. Therefore, dato will say something like having been given, or perhaps just given. I've said a few times that perfect passive participles in English often end with the letters ed, but here's an example of a perfect passive participle in English that does not end with ed. Here it's got en, so given instead of gived. So in English, given is a perfect passive participle of the verb give. So signo and dato together say, the signal having been given. We could throw in the word with and say, with the signal having been given. So number 7 could say something like this. The signal having been given, our troops made an attack. Let's say we want to try to find a finer shade of meaning here. Let's try out some different kinds. Could we say, because the signal was given, our troops made an attack? Probably not. If the signal was given, our troops made an attack? Nah, that doesn't work either. Could it be concessive with the word although? Could we say, although the signal was given, our troops made an attack? No, that doesn't really work either. So the best meaning here probably is related to timing. Something like, after the signal was given, our men made an attack. But honestly, we don't even need to translate it that way. A simple translation is best. So we could just say, the signal having been given, our troops made an attack. And that's just fine like that. Number 8 is next. Convocatis principibus, Caesar eos accusat. Our main clause here is Caesar eos accusat, and convocatis principibus is an ablative absolute. So let's leave that out for the moment and look at the main clause. In the main clause, Caesar is the subject, the verb is accusat. Accuso is one of our new verbs for this lesson. Accuso, accusare, accusavi, accusatum. So this verb here is present tense, third person singular. So the subject and verb says, Caesar is accusing. Eos is a form of is ea id. It can mean this, that, he, she, or it. In the plural, it can mean they. Here it's accusative plural, so we might translate it as them. So our main clause here says, Caesar is accusing them. Eos is providing us with the direct object. So let's take a look at the ablative absolute. The noun here is principibus. That's a form of the third declension noun princeps, which means something like chief, leader. It's related to our English word principal. So it has the idea of someone who's first, in the sense of chief or leader. It's ablative plural because it's part of an ablative absolute. Convocatis is a form of the verb convoco. Of course, voco means to call. Con means together or with, and so convoco means to call together. Or you could translate it perhaps as summon. The four principal parts of voco are voco, vocare, vocavi, vocatum. So you can see here that convocatis is a perfect passive participle form of the verb convoco. Convocatis communicates the idea that the act of calling together was performed in the past, the activity of calling together has been completed, and the activity of being called together was experienced passively by someone or something. Here it's the leaders, the principibus. So convocatis and principibus together will say, the leaders having been called together. So a literal translation for number 8 might say this: with the leaders having been called together, Caesar is accusing them. But if we flip around the ablative absolute and translate it in a way that makes it active, here's what would happen. Having called together the leaders, Caesar is accusing them. That makes a pretty smooth English translation because it makes Caesar the subject doing the action of calling them together and the subject of the action of accusing. So it has a tendency to unify the sentence and make it sound nice and smooth in English. So a literal translation would say this: with the leaders having been called together, Caesar is accusing them. A non-literal translation with the passive participle rendered as active and with the leaders rendered as a direct object, it would sound like this: having called together the leaders, Caesar is accusing them. Number 9 is next. Equites a civitate missi ad Caesarem venerunt. Our subject here is equites, and the verb is venerunt. Venerunt is a form of the verb venio, which means come. That's a fourth conjugation verb. And so venerunt is perfect tense, third person plural. So it means they came, and the they being referred to is the equites. That's the cavalry, or perhaps better, cavalrymen, because it's talking about, people, not necessarily their horses too. So the cavalrymen came. Ad Caesarem means to Caesar. That's pretty simple. Now let's look at the perfect passive participle, missi. That's a form of the verb mitto, which means send. The four principal parts, mitto, mittere, missi, missum. And so here, missi, you can see, is a perfect passive participle form of mitto. So we can translate it as having been sent, or perhaps just sent. The perfect passive participle missi tells us that the action of sending was done in the past, that the action is completed, and that the action of being sent was experienced by someone or something passively. So we can translate missi as having been sent, or simply sent. Notice that missi is nominative plural and masculine, and so it's modifying equites. So equites and missi together say, the cavalrymen having been sent. Now we have a prepositional phrase, a civitate. What does it mean? The word civitate is a form of the noun civitas, which means state. The preposition a here, that's a or ab, depending on how it's spelled. And that can mean from. So this could say from the state, and that would give us the cavalrymen having been sent from the state. That actually makes pretty good sense. But this could also be something else. It's a good time to review here the idea that in Latin, when you have a passive verb of any kind, even a passive participle, which is really an adjective, you can have an ablative noun that tells you by whom that passive action is being performed. If you have a straight ablative and it's an inanimate object of some kind, it's probably an ablative of means. And you can translate that as by means of, or perhaps by. If it's a person doing the action, often what you'll get is the preposition a or ab with the ablative, and that's an ablative of agent. So generally speaking, if it's a person, you get a or ab plus the ablative. If it's a thing, you just get a straight ablative without any kind of preposition along with it. So a civitas is a state, but what is a state made up of? It's made up of people. So this very well could be an ablative of agent. It could be saying the cavalrymen having been sent by the state. So a civitate here either means from the state or by the state. My gut feeling here is that it's an ablative of agent, treating civitate as people, as the people who make up the state. So here's how we'll translate number 9. The cavalrymen, having been sent by the state, came to Caesar. Number 10 is next. Labienus monte occupato nostros expectabat. Monte occupato is an ablative absolute, therefore we can leave it out in our initial translation because it doesn't grammatically interact with anything else in the sentence. So our main clause here is Labienus nostros expectabat. The subject here is Labienus. He was one of Caesar's top generals. The verb is expectabat. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's the verb expecto. Here it's imperfect tense, third person singular. So that means he, she, or it was waiting for, he, she, or it was expecting. Nostros is the adjective noster, which means our. Here it's accusative plural. This is what we call a substantive adjective. Nostros means our soldiers, our men, our troops. Take your pick. So the main clause here says, Labienus was waiting for our troops. That leaves us with the ablative absolute, which is monte occupato. Both of those words are ablative singular. Monte is a form of the third declension noun mons, which means mountain. Mons montis. And so monte is ablative singular. Occupato is a form of the verb occupo, which means to seize. Occupo, occupare, occupave, occupatum. Therefore, you can see occupato is a perfect passive participle form of that verb. Therefore, occupato communicates the idea that seizing was done in the past. The activity of seizing is completed, and the activity of seizing was experienced passively by someone or something. In this case, it's the mountain. The mountain in the past experienced passively the action of being seized. So monte occupato says the mountain having been seized. Okay, so number 10 would say Labienus, the mountain having been seized, was waiting for our troops. Now, for the sake of smoothness in our English translation, we could render the ablative absolute in a non-literal way and make it sound active, and make the mountain sound as if it's the direct object of the action. And if we do that, it makes Labienus sound like the person actively doing the activity of the seizing. So let's try this. Labienus, having seized the mountain, was waiting for our troops. That sounds pretty good in English because it makes Labienus the subject of both the action of the seizing and the action of the weighting. It has kind of a unifying factor. So you can see the appeal that that would have for a translator, someone translating this into English. That would be an attractive way to do it. But it's not literal. Literally, it says, the mountain having been seized. Number 11 is next. Urgetorix, Messala et Pisone consulibus, regni cupiditate inductus, coniurationem nobilitatis, fecit. Here in number 11, we have a main clause with an ablative absolute embedded in the middle. So our subject here is Urgetorix. He's one of the leaders of one of the Gallic tribes. And then fecit is the verb. Fecit is a perfect tense form of facio, which means do or make. It's third person singular. So fecit means he, she, or it made, or he, she, or it did. So subject and verb together say Urgetorix did or Urgetorix made. The direct object is coniurationem. That's accusative singular of the noun coniuratio, which means conspiracy. So Urgetorix made a conspiracy, and it's a conspiracy of the nobility, because nobilitatis is genitive singular. That's the noun nobilitas, which means nobility, not like the quality of being noble, but the social class known as the nobility, that is the aristocracy. Okay, so what we have so far would say Urgetorix made a conspiracy of the nobility. The part that says Messala et Pisone consulibus, that's an ablative absolute. Let's set that aside for a moment. The word inductus is a perfect passive participle, which is an adjective, and it's modifying Urgetorix. Inductus is a form of one of our new verbs for this lesson, which is induco. That's just duco with a prepositional prefix, the word in. So the four principal parts are duco, ducere, duxi, ductum. So as you can see, the word inductus is a perfect passive participle. It means having been induced. It tells us that the action of being induced was done in the past, that it was finished in the past, and that it was experienced by someone or something passively. So we can translate it into English as induced or having been induced. Either of those will work fine. And again, it modifies Urgetorix. So here's how we can fit it into the sentence. We can say Urgetorix, having been induced, made a conspiracy of the nobility. We have an ablative of means here, which is cupiditate. That's the ablative singular form of cupiditas, which means desire. And that's telling us what did the inducing. Okay, so inductus says having been induced, and then cupiditate says by the desire. Okay, ablative of means. And then we have an objective genitive here, regni, which means of the kingship, or of kingship. It's genitive singular. So regni, cupiditate, and inductus, those three words together say, having been induced by the desire of kingship. Okay, so Urgetorix had his eye on being in charge of his Gallic tribe. He wanted to be the king. So what we have so far says, Urgetorix, induced by the desire of kingship, made a conspiracy of the nobility. Now we have an ablative absolute remaining here, Messala et Pisone consulibus. This is the kind of ablative absolute that consists solely of nouns. Okay, Messala is someone's name. Pisone is someone's name. Of course, they're in the ablative case. Pisone is the ablative singular form of piso. And consulibus is ablative plural of the third declension noun consul. And so this ablative absolute here says, with Messala and Piso as consuls. If you want to go back to section 277, this is just like example number 6 there. So we can translate this any number of ways. We can say, while Messala and Piso were consuls, when Messala and Piso were consuls, with Messala and Piso being consuls, it really doesn't matter as long as you communicate that it was during that time. The way they would designate a year is by saying who was consul that year. Sometimes we do this in English too. In the United States, sometimes we'll say things like, well, back during the Eisenhower administration or back during the Nixon administration, blah, blah, blah happened. So it's kind of like that. So number 11 altogether will say this. When Messala and Piso were consuls, or Geterics, induced by a desire of kingship or by a desire for kingship, made a conspiracy of the nobility. Number 12 is next. Galba frumenti inopia per motus in provinciam contendit, et nullo hoste prohibente legionem in allobroges perduxit. Here in number 12, we have two independent clauses joined by the conjunction et. So let's take a look at the first one first. The subject here, of course, is galba, and the verb here in this first clause is contendit. Now, contendit is an interesting verb. It's a form of the verb contendo, which means strive, fight, or hasten. It's based on the verb tendo. And this particular form could actually be present tense, third person singular, or it could be perfect tense, third person singular. Both of those forms are spelled the same way. But if you'll notice, at the end of the sentence, perduxit is definitely perfect tense. So I'm guessing that contendit is perfect tense as well. So let's translate contendit as hasten. And so we'll say he, she, or it hastened. And so what that gives us for our subject and verb here in this first clause is galba hastened. In provinciam says into the province. Notice that the preposition in is taking the accusative there, and so we're translating it as into. So galba hastened into the province. And now we have a perfect passive participle modifying galba. Keep in mind that galba, even though it's a first declension noun, it's still masculine. So the participle per motus has the masculine us ending on it, even though it's modifying the first declension noun galba. So galba is a person's name, a man, and so he is per motus. What does per motus mean? Well, that's a perfect passive participle of one of our new verbs for this lesson, and that's the verb per moeo at the very top of page 105. Per and moeo together, per moeo says to influence. So we can translate per motus as having been influenced. And here, as is often the case, we have an ablative telling us by whom or by what this passive activity was performed. Per motus tells us that the action of influencing happened in the past, its completed action, and that it was experienced by someone or something passively. So we can translate per motus as influenced or having been influenced. And then the word inopia here is an ablative telling us by whom that influencing was done. In this case, it's an inanimate object. Inopia means lack. Notice the macron over the final A there, so that's ablative singular. When it's an inanimate object like this, you don't need any kind of preposition. Just a straight ablative will make an ablative of means. Inopia and per motus together can say having been influenced by lack, by a lack or by the lack. Frumenti is genitive singular. That means of grain. And so those three words together say having been influenced by a lack of grain. So this first clause here says galba, having been influenced by a lack of grain, hurried or hastened into the province. Now we have the conjunction et, which means and, so that will just launch us into a brand new independent clause. Nullo, hoste, and prohibente together are an ablative absolute. Let's leave that alone for a moment. The main verb here in this clause is perduxit. You may have noticed it's simply the verb duco, which means lead, with a prepositional prefix, in this case, per. When you have the prefix per on a verb, it can mean a couple of things. It can mean to do something vehemently or strongly, or it can simply mean through. And in this case, it apparently just means through. So per duco means to lead through. And as I mentioned previously, it's perfect tense, third person singular. So per duxit says he, she, or it led through. And of course, galba is still the subject. The word galba is not present here in this second clause. We're simply reusing it from the first clause. So galba is still the subject, and he led through, and we need a direct object. That's legionem, which means legion. Notice that it's accusative singular. In allobroges is a prepositional phrase. Allobroges is accusative, so we'll translate in as into. So this clause here says, he led a legion through into the allobroges. Our ablative absolute here is interesting for two reasons. Number one, it consists of 3 words instead of the usual 2. And also, it contains a present tense participle. We discussed that present participles in Latin are active, and they come from the third declension. They decline like third declension I stems. So the verb prohibeo means to prevent or keep someone back or block someone, perhaps. Prohibeo, by the way, is simply the verb habeo with the prepositional prefix pro. The preposition pro can mean lots of different things in Latin. Probably the meaning it carries, joined with the verb habeo, is in front of. So pro habeo, literally to hold something out in front of you, in the sense of hold it off from you or keep it off from you, something like that. So nullo, hoste, and prohibente are all ablative singular. Hoste is a form of the noun hostis, which means enemy, and then nullo means no, as in none or not any. So nullo and hoste together say no enemy. So with the present active participle prohibente, this ablative absolute says something like, with no enemy stopping, or with no enemy preventing. Okay, so with no enemy preventing, that tells us the circumstances of what is happening in the second part of the sentence, when he leads the legion through into the allobroges. So number 12 as a whole could say this: Galba, having been influenced by a lack of grain, hurried or hastened into the province, and, with no enemy preventing, he led the legion through into the allobroges. Now, if you'll notice in footnote number 4, the authors of the book would like us to find some other finer shade of meaning with which to translate this ablative absolute. And they're telling us that they want us to translate it expressing cause. So in order to do that, we could throw in the word since, like this: Galba, influenced by the lack of grain, hastened into the province, and since no enemy was preventing, he led the legion through into the allobroges. Notice that prohibente is a present active participle, so technically it says preventing, as in right now. But since all the other verbs in this sentence are in a past tense, that is contendit and perduxit, I took the liberty of putting the ablative absolute in the past tense as well in my translation to make the translation sound better. Instead of saying, since no enemy is preventing, if I did it that way, it would pull us back to the present tense in our translation, and then I would have to jump back into the past tense. So to smooth it all out and make all the English sound the same, I threw in the word was and said, since no enemy was preventing. Number 13 is next. Caesar legatos naves expectare usit. In this particular exercise, we have Caesar giving a command using the verb eubeo. Eubeo is from the second conjugation. The 4 principal parts are eubeo, eubere, iusi, iusum. So ussit here is a perfect tense form. It's third person singular. So ussit says he, she, or it commanded, or he, she, or it ordered. And the subject is Caesar. So the basic structure here, the basic skeleton of the sentence is Caesar ordered. And the way you use this particular verb of commanding or ordering is that the person being commanded is in the accusative. As you become more advanced in Latin, you'll find that there are lots of ways to give commands, some of which I'm sure we'll cover in the remainder of these lectures. There's another commonly used verb that means to command or order, which is the verb impero, I-M-P-E-R-O. When you use that verb to give a command, the people being commanded are in the dative case. So that has a different grammatical structure associated with it. But with eubeo, the people being commanded are in the accusative case. And so that's why legatos here is in the accusative. So subject, verb, and direct object are Caesar ordered the legatos. And how can we translate legatos here? We know that legati in Caesar's Gallic Wars can mean Caesar's top generals, or it can refer to diplomatic representatives like envoys or ambassadors. From what little context we have, it seems like that's an order he would give to his top generals, his assistant generals, or perhaps lieutenant generals. So let's translate legatos as generals. So what we have so far would say Caesar ordered the generals, and now we have an accusative plus infinitive kind of structure. This is not indirect speech, but it has a similar kind of structure. Notice the infinitive expectare is here working along with legatos. Expectare is a form of one of our new verbs for this lesson. Expecto means to wait for or expect. Expectare is simply the present tense active infinitive. That is the second principal part of that verb. So with expectare working from legatos, here's what we have. Caesar ordered the generals to wait, or perhaps to wait for. And then expectare has a direct object, which is naves. That's the third declension noun navis, which means ship, and it is accusative plural, so it's the direct object of expectare. So number 13 really isn't too difficult. Caesar ordered the generals to wait for the ships. Number 14 is next. Milites ipsi sunt parati ad oppugnandam noreiam. Our main clause here is milites ipsi sunt parati. The subject here is milites, that means soldiers. That's nominative plural, third declension. And sunt is the verb. So our subject and verb says the soldiers are. Parati means prepared. That's a perfect passive participle of the verb paro, which means to prepare. So paratus, parata, paratum means prepared. And as you can see here, parati is nominative plural, just like milites, because it is modifying milites. Grammatically speaking, parati would be what we call a predicate adjective. So milites, sunt, and parati together say the soldiers are prepared. We covered ipse a few lessons ago. Ipse is the intensive pronoun. We translate it into English as himself, herself, itself, themselves, things like that. So ipsi, being nominative plural and masculine, is modifying milites. So milites ipsi says the soldiers themselves. So our main clause here says the soldiers themselves are prepared. Now we have ad oppugnandam noreiam. Here we have a gerundive, oppugnandam, which is modifying noreiam. Okay, noreia is a place, a town. Oppugnandam is a form of the verb oppugno, which means to attack. That is a future passive participle, also known as a gerundive. And so it expresses that action is going to be done in the future, and that action will be experienced passively. And there's also the connotation that the action needs to be done, ought to be done, or must be done. Okay, so that's what a gerundive tells you. So we could translate oppugnandum as to be attacked. With gerundives, if you see the preposition ad, it can often mean for the purpose of. Ad and oppugnandum and noreiam say something like this: for the purpose of noreia, to be attacked. Of course, the verb oppugno is simply the verb pugno, which means fight, along with the preposition ob, and because of assimilation, the B turns into a P. And so instead of ob pugno, you get oppugno. So oppugno means things like attack, or sometimes in this book, they'll translate it as storm, as into storm a castle or storm a fort. We can simply translate it as attack here. So a literal word-for-word translation here would say this: the soldiers themselves are prepared for the purpose of noreia, to be attacked. Of course, that doesn't really say a whole lot in English, so we can do our usual trick of rearranging the way we translate the gerundive. When we translate to English, we can make it sound like the passive activity of the gerundive is being done actively, and that the noun in the gerundive is the object of that active activity. So here's what we can do. The soldiers themselves are prepared for the purpose of attacking noreia. Okay, that's a non-literal translation in which we change a couple of things around to create a smooth English translation. We could smooth things out even further like this. We could say, the soldiers themselves are prepared to attack noreia. That would be even more colloquial and smooth English. Okay, that does it for this lesson. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your hard work, and we'll see you in the next lesson.